The first belief is this. Belief number one. This is a fear-based belief, right, that we have. Belief number one is I cannot cope with all of my emotions. All right. Now, let's just look at this fear from a practical point of view. If I believe that, can you see how that's going to stop me from having my emotional experiences? If I believe I'm not going to be able to cope with every single emotion that's going to come at me from within myself, because that's the only place they can come from within yourself. If I believe that, then I am going to start shutting down emotional experiences that I believe I'm not going to be able to cope with. So what we finish up doing when we're in this state is we say, all right, the divine love path is, we've got to be allowing our emotions on the divine love path to connect to God. You know, love is emotional, so I've got to learn how to love, so that's an emotion too. So I start seeing the relationship between emotions and love and connecting to God. So I understand all of that. And so I then go down the track of, all right, what emotions can I cope with? Oh, I can cope with, you know, feeling fear about somebody being angry with me. Yeah, I cope with that. So what I do is my soul creates an event where somebody's angry with me and I go into my fear about that, feel that, and I get through that. And then after a while, if I've dealt with that from a causal emotion, gone through some grief, what eventually happens is nobody gets angry with me anymore. And that's wonderful, so I've had some gain there. But then I might have been abused as a child. And that's a whole set of emotions, isn't it? Like if any of you have been abused as a child, either sexually or violently, know how difficult it is to work through those groups of emotions, right? Now those emotions, I might definitely have this feeling that I just cannot cope with them. And so I put those emotions to the side, over there, in that box over there, and then I usually put a few books on top of that box, and you know what I mean? And eventually I make that box disappear from my own consciousness. And so then I go down and eventually you come up to someone like AJ or someone else who's connected with their emotions too, and you say, you know, I reckon I've dealt with most of the things in my life, and they can feel this thing. And oh, have you dealt with your abuse issue when you were a child? Oh, I don't remember being abused when I was a child. Oh, okay. What's happened? What's happened is that there's so many blockages now to that box of emotion that we can't even connect with the fact that that's even happened. Right? But that whole box is going to have to be opened, you know, and allowed out. Now, if I believe this, that I cannot cope with all of my emotions, I am never going to open that box. You see the problem with that belief? If I believe that, that box is going to stay closed. And I will pass over into the spirit world, and I've talked to literally thousands and thousands of spirits who still have the same box closed. You know, a lot of people on earth have this belief that when I pass over into the spirit world, that means all of a sudden I'm all-knowing and all of my problems are gone and I don't have any more emotions that are sad anymore to deal with and everything's fine. And that's not what happens, because I've talked to literally thousands of spirits where that hasn't happened. What's happened instead is that they've had this belief that they can't cope with their emotions, with all their emotions, that got constructed at a very young age in their life on earth, and they still have that same belief in the spirit world. And they live in that state for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. A few weeks ago, we talked to a group of spirits who travelled with myself and Mary in the 1st century. And that group of spirits still were locked up in this state. They felt that they couldn't feel some of their emotions about what happened in their interaction with myself after 2,000 years. So don't think that just because you've, you know, had some kind of death experience or gone and died and then everything's going to be fine, because while you have that belief in you, it's not going to be fine. We need to deal with this belief, this number one fear-based belief. Number two fear-based belief. I am alone. Now, I'm not saying to change these beliefs, by the way, not intellectually anyway, right? What I'm saying is we need to recognise these as major impediments to our emotional processing. Now, an extension of I am alone is God doesn't care for me. God doesn't exist. I haven't got any spirit friends around me who exist. I've got no friends on earth really who care about my emotions either. I am alone. And what I'm saying is that that belief shuts you down in a state of fear from experiencing your emotion. Does that make sense? There are many flavours of these beliefs. Like a flavour of this belief could be things like my emotions are, look, I just went. My emotions are big. And I just went. This happened to me earlier this morning too. I might go to that. Yeah. I won't fix it. Is that still working? Yeah, that's still working. These are both on the same system, so it means this thing is going. All right, so my number one belief, this I cannot cope with all of my emotions, that belief can cause other subsequent beliefs, is what I'm discussing. And other subsequent beliefs are, my emotions are too big to be able to be felt by one person. The truth is, of course, quite different to that. If the emotion entered you, then it can certainly exit you. Right? But a lot of times we have these emotions enter us, get stored, another one enters us, gets stored, another one enters us, gets stored, another one enters us, gets stored. What happens then? We've now got 5 of them, and now it's starting to look pretty big, right? So this is the result of us not being able to release the emotions one by one. This one is more insidious. This one is basically saying that there is no God, and there's no God that cares for you. You are alone. God doesn't love you. That's a big belief, a fear-based belief that the majority of the earth has. Now, with these 2 primary fear-based beliefs, we will not experience causal emotion. You'll get to a causal emotion that you need to experience, and you won't be able to experience it because one of those 2 beliefs is present in us. So obviously one of the first things we need to do is emotionally experience those beliefs. Does that make sense? Because remember, fear can only be released by the emotional experience of fear. How do you release that you're alone? By actually feeling you're alone and releasing that emotion, by actually feeling the emotion. It's only the unfelt emotions that get locked up or stored inside of you. When the emotions are in motion, when they're actually being felt by you, they're no longer getting locked up inside of you. Now, let's look at those things in terms of what the truth is. Now, what I've done is written in the outline that I've given, that I'll be putting on the net, some of the truths about this. And I wanted to read them because there's some quotes from different people that I want to get right. One is from a lady who wrote a heap of childhood books. Her name's Trace Moroney. Have any of you heard of her? Trace Moroney. She wrote this book and a group of books, actually. One of these books is called When I Am Feeling Scared. My suggestion is buy her whole set of books. Excellent books, all of them. Anyway, this is a quote from one of these books. When children trust themselves to handle painful feelings of fear, anger and sadness, they gain an inner security that allows them to embrace the world in which they live. With greater tolerance of painful feelings, children become free to enjoy their world, to feel secure in their abilities and to be happy. You see, you imagine the gift of a little child knowing that no matter what emotion it has to face in its life, it's going to be able to deal with it. That's a pretty big gift, isn't it? And most of our children actually believe that, believe it or not, before we get involved in their lives, they actually believe that. But what happens is all of this multi-generational stuff gets imposed on them and eventually they no longer believe that. So that addresses this truth, this error, doesn't it? Or this fear is addressed by that truth. If I have the confidence to deal with every single emotion that's within me, no matter what it is, then of course I am going to feel like I'm pretty secure within myself. I won't need you to fix my emotion. I won't need you to make anything feel better. I can be alone and still feel totally secure. Right? Very important. A quote from the Paget Messages. From all this you may understand that we spirits who know the truth have the great work to do, to enable these darkened spirits to understand and believe that their false hopes and dreadful fears have no foundation in truth and will never be realised. You see, this is the other problem with fear. If something happens when we're a child, gets locked up inside of us, and we then carry that around with us the rest of our life, thinking it's going to happen again. Right? But most of the time it never happens again. Right? Most of the time the things we are afraid of never happen again. And of course when we get to the spirit world, they can't happen again. You see? And so unfortunately a lot of people, by the time they get to the spirit world, have such a strong belief inside of them that these things, that they need to be afraid of these things, that it's now only their belief that stops them from progressing. So for instance, let's say you were growing up in a religion when you're on earth, 4 or 5 going along to Sunday school, and you get told that if you do a bad thing, if you lie, you'll be in hell forever. Now many of you have been told this in your childhoods, right? Now you imagine, if you come to believe that emotionally, what's going to happen? Right. Well, for a start, there's a high likelihood you won't do anything wrong by the definition of the people who gave you that belief. But secondly, you are now so locked up in fear of doing something wrong that you often will get into the mode of never trying anything at all, just in case you might do something wrong. And you'll be so locked up in that belief that you'll even believe that if you have done something wrong, that you're condemned forever. Now, these are beliefs that people pass with over into the spirit world. And what's all that about? It's all about some underlying causal emotional beliefs that we have some terror or fear about in the end. Many of you will notice even with other things that you weren't afraid when you were little. Like, how many of you played with spiders when you were small? Right? How many of you same people found that mum or dad really went into a panic when you did it? Okay? Right? I remember playing with a redback spider when I was very small. I was about 2 or so, and I put it on my hand and I walked in to my mum to give her the redback spider, and she went absolutely ballistic. Right? Now many of us will think that's a realistic fear, but it's not really. I wasn't afraid of it and the redback wasn't biting me, but since that moment, what do you think I've been afraid of? Some spiders, right? And so naturally, sooner or later, because of this fear, it's going to get triggered, isn't it? So I've had spiders falling on me. I've gone, and you know, all sorts of things that happened with spiders since that time. Before then, everything was fine and I was fine with them. And ironically, the same thing happened to my youngest son as well. His mother did the same thing with him, and he's in the same state with spiders. So why did that happen? It's because I've had this fear injected, if you like, into me, and now it's lived with me until I release it. So I'm not afraid of them now because I've had to release that. Does that make sense? I've had to deal with that emotion and release that and experience that emotion. How do you do that? You go and get a movie like Arachnophobia. You ever seen that movie? Where there's spiders walking inside of people's nose and these big things, like big spiders, right? And what you do is you sit down with the movie and you play it over and over again and feel your terror about it and just allow yourself to experience it. Or, like some of the other things I've done, is lay down and just imagine spiders crawling over me and just laying there and not being able to do anything. Right? And just feel the fear that comes up and breathe, diaphragmatically breathe and just feel the fear, feel the fear, feel the fear, until you can get to the point where you can pick one up. And then there's still a little more work I feel I've got to do with it, because I still have a tendency to still avoid them a little. So I'm not afraid with them anyway, I can pick them up and whatever, but I still have this tendency there's this initial, you know how you have that initial, oh, what's that? Oh, that's a spider. Like, so there's still a little bit of fear there, right? Still there needing to be dealt with. But eventually you can work. So these two, getting back to these two primary beliefs, this second one I'd like to talk about a little more. Most of us have the problem that we don't really know God yet, right? So how do you actually love someone you don't feel you know? That's a difficulty, isn't it? And then how do you receive love from someone who you not even sure exists? Because you've never had a personal experience of God, or you've never seen God, or, you know what I mean? Like, so how do you know that you can connect to God? So this is a big issue that we need to allow ourselves to address as a fear as well. So let's look at some of the comments about the second part from a truth perspective. I mean, belief in the truth that there is a close relationship between God and the individual, which may be established by prayer and the longings of the soul for the inflowing of God's love. So this is a quote from the Book of Truths there, if you like. So the truth is that these celestial spirits were saying that there is the truth of you being able to have a close relationship with God, and that relationship is established by the longings of your soul. So they're telling you that truth. But when you hear that truth, you go, oh, I don't feel any close relationship with God, you know. In my life, I've only had, a few experiences that I thought God was involved in, and even then I don't really know whether it was God or might have been a spirit, for all I know, now that I'm learning about spirits, and I don't really know. And so this is why many of us also get into the pattern of, we know that we've felt our spirit guide with us, some of us, right? And so we start talking to them instead of God, right? So we start having relationships with spirits instead. And many of us who have had a history on the New Age path would probably feel that way. There's another quote. God's love is for the mortal, even if he has the passions and appetites which the flesh encumbers him with. And when a mortal fights against the temptations which these burdens impose and overcomes them, he, when he enters the spirit world, is stronger and more able to progress than when he puts off the great attempt until he becomes purely spirit. You see, part of this thing is, I've heard many of you say, I think I'll put off dealing with my emotions until I pass. Right? It's going to be easier there. Right? And here we have a spirit saying totally the opposite to you, that it's actually easier if you pass knowing how to deal with your emotions, knowing how to deal with your passions and desires, knowing how to deal with your fears. It's going to be easier when you pass. But often we go down the track, no, it's pretty hard. Like, you know, gee, last week I cried for how many hours, 4 hours or whatever, and that was pretty intense when I did that, we might feel. And I don't want to do that anymore. You know, I just want to have fun. Girls just want to have fun. You know, so off we go, and we just go and have the fun, avoiding the emotions, right? And the problem with that is that we finish up passing without a real clear idea of how to deal with my emotions, with a lot of fear in me, and it's not easier there. These spirits are saying from their own experience that it's not. Here's another one. As you are aware, God's love is all around you and may be in you, and if permitted to flow into your soul with faith accompanying it, you'll find yourself growing in at one with the Father and realise that fact. You see, often we don't even permit God's love to enter us because we're in such a state of fear that we don't even want to connect with God. So there's all these issues about I'm alone. It's a big fear. There's like whole groups of issues, if you like, involved in that. Now, you get into a causal emotion where you're feeling some terror, and you will feel very alone in that moment, right? And so then what we have a tendency of doing is saying, all right, I'm totally alone, I can't experience this, and then we go into this one, I can't cope with this emotion, I'm alone doing this, I can't cope with this emotion. And what we've just told ourselves is two complete untruths. The truth is, right at the moment you're dealing with a causal emotion, sometimes even hundreds of people are around you and from the spirit world trying to assist you to connect with that. And God is certainly with you as well. So you're not alone.
And then on top of that, God designed you to experience all of your emotions. That's the way God designed you. So you are designed to cope with everything. That's how you're designed. You don't need anyone else to help you cope with anything because you are designed to cope with it yourself. These two fear-based beliefs cause huge amounts of problems for us in our own processing. Does that make sense? Now, they are the first two beliefs. If you can deal with those two beliefs and release them emotionally, if you can deal with them, what will happen is the rest of your emotions will flow much more rapidly. All right?